So, here's today's agenda. The first opening activity is just going to be a general poll, and you guys will answer the question, what lecture material did you struggle with the most in this unit? That one should be fairly simple and shouldn't take us that long. I just want to gauge generally what you guys have found the most difficult at this point and at this time. Then we're going to go over concept outlines. So if you attended my first alternative virtual SI session, you'll know what this is. But for those of you who didn't, essentially what I do is I make outlines of major lecture themes or topics, and I kind of break the outlines down in the session and help you guys navigate how I would consolidate the material and make it more digestible and stuff like that and easier to understand. And then after each outline, or in this case, we're just going to do after each slide. After each slide, I'll ask you guys a poll question just to see how well you followed along and stuff like that. And then we'll move on. Then the last activity is going to be sort of like a word bubble activity on a Jamboard. And I know Jessica likes to use Jamboards in her sessions, so maybe you're familiar with it. This is my first time using Jamboard, but it should work well. And I think I understand how to use it. And essentially, you guys will be discussing after all of this review that we've done, which topics do you think should receive the most attention heading into the exam as you study. And then finally, just like usual, we're going to have Q&A, which that's free time for you to ask any questions about SI or class material, regardless of whether we covered it in the session or not. So yeah. And I see a couple of people have joined the session since I started, so I'm just going to share the slides again in chat. Real quick, if you have not been to an alternative virtual SI session before, please read over the slide. It has all the expectations, what you can expect of me and what I expect of you. I'm not going to go over it in detail right now because I don't want to eat up our time. That's very valuable, but this is there for you. Please read over it if you don't know what the rules are, and that should be good. All right. So with that being said, why don't we hop into the very first activity, which is the big poll question. And let me get the poll up for you guys right now. Yes. All right. So I just launched the poll. I'll give you guys about a minute or two to answer the poll. Just let me know which lecture you found the most difficult, most challenging, stuff like that. And we'll just kind of look over it and kind of reflect on it a bit. All right, I'm going to end the poll now. So let me share the results with you all. So here are the results. It looks like it's kind of split evenly throughout. I will say the one thing is that plant evolutionary history doesn't seem to be much of a problem for most of you. So that's good. And then as far as front runners, we really have photosynthesis, photorespiration, plant hormones and responses, and then plant reproduction. Photosynthesis and photorespiration, as well as plant hormones and responses. There's a lot of information there, lots of moving parts, so I can understand why those are challenging, particularly challenging lectures. Plant reproduction, in my opinion, I think it's not a super challenging lecture necessarily, but it is a newer lecture, so you might still be wrapping your head around it, and that's totally fine. I will not be covering photosynthesis and photorespiration today because I did cover that in the last alternative virtual SI session. So if you want review on that, that will be the video to watch. So, and the outlines from the slides that I used in that session will also be something you should look to. Those will be the main resources here. I will be going over plant hormones and responses today, and we might get to plant reproduction, but that'll be more of like an independent activity. And if you have questions about photosynthesis or photorespiration that you really want to get answered today, the Q&A will probably be the time to get those answered. But we won't be covering it in the main activity. So I'm just letting you guys know. But yeah, all right. So those are the results. And that's kind of where we're looking at kind of standing as a group, looking at the material for Unit 2. So with that being said, I'm going to jump us straight into the main activity. So today I have new concept outlines. I'm not covering any of the stuff that I covered in the last alternative virtual SI session, just like I said, because that video is obviously there for you and you can use that as a reference. These are completely new outlines. I have created concept outlines for plant growth and development. I have a question for plant growth and development, also a concept outline for plant hormones and responses, and a question for that as well. And then for plant water relations and plant reproduction, I think because those are new, if we have time, I'd like to have you guys sort of create an outline based on the stuff that I'm showing here in these outlines. Or if we don't have time to cover it, then hopefully you guys can at least try and make outlines that are similar to this for plant water relations and plant reproduction on your own, using these as references for what you can do, and hopefully that'll help you lay out the material better. But we are on limited time, so there's only so much we can cover in this session. One thing I will say before we get started, one final note, is that last time there were a lot of questions during the session, and I really appreciate all the questions you guys have. But there is a lot of stuff that we have to get through. So this time, I might be a little more picky about which questions I answer. Specifically, like if you ask a question and someone already asked that question earlier in the session or something like that, and I answered it, I probably won't answer it the second time because it's already been covered. So just a heads up, pay attention to what your fellow classmates are asking, what questions are asking. So if they ask a question that you wanted to ask, you can get the answer when I explain it to them or something like that. So yeah, please do still put questions in the chat when you have them. But we're gonna try and steam through these outlines as much as possible today. All right. So the first outline that we're really going to cover today is the outlines for plant growth and plant development. Both topics that we kind of covered earlier on, like about midway into the unit, and very closely related. I would say not super super complex or anything compared to maybe some of the other lectures that we looked at, but definitely a lot of stuff that you need to know in this lecture. So yeah, let's get started with plant growth. So plant growth, obviously, there's a lot of different types of growth patterns that you'll view in plants that will be exhibited by plants. And we'll start off with 3 of them to begin with: the indeterminate growth pattern, determinate growth pattern, and primary growth pattern. So let's start with indeterminate growth. Indeterminate growth is essentially when you're looking at a cell, is the cell being developed to specialize in anything for the plant, or is the cell just generally being used to help grow the plant's mass, sort of extend it? It's like a general purpose cell. It doesn't really have a specific purpose or function. It's just generally there to support the plant, and it doesn't, it's more of an early stage thing that you'll see more often in embryos or ovules, like fertilized ovules, stuff like that. Indeterminate growth will probably be observed early plant life, from the seedling and stuff like that. Then determinate growth you see later on down the line when you have more of a plant has established itself, and at that point it really wants to develop very specific functions within its cells that can accomplish certain things, either as parts of leaves or as flowers, extra components that define the plant. That's really what determinate growth is. Again, it's in the cell. We're really looking at the cell here. So that's what determinate growth is, and that's later stage life in the plants, like after early stage. And then is um, primary growth can cover indeterminate growth and determinate growth. It's really just something that is observed in every plant, and it just describes how plants grow up from the ground, specifically growing vertically, because obviously all plants are trying to get closer to sunlight and get more light so that they can photosynthesize better. And so primary growth is really important for that. But primary growth, you're looking more at the plant rather than the cell, and specifically vertical growth from the stem. And on that note, we look at different parts of the plant that sort of assist with primary growth and all these different type of growth patterns. Um, Big pieces of important pieces are the shoot apical meristem, or the SAM, right here, as well as the root apical meristem, which is RAM. And the shoot apical meristem is essentially like the top of the stem and essentially drives the plant's upward growth, whereas the root apical meristem sort of has root caps, which are driving into the ground, searching for nutrients and trying to get the structural base of the plant solidified. And so those are the two different ways. The RAM helping, lower growth, and the SAM helping upper growth and stuff like that. And yeah, I have the root cap here that helps with the RAM. Then other pieces that grow off of the stem, you have the axillary buds. So axillary buds are coming off to the side of the stem and are responsible for like branch growth and stuff like that. Um, Really, not often developed until the plant has some height to it and has grown vertically a decent bit. But yeah, it helps the plant grow out to its sides, not necessarily wider, but just out to the sides so that it takes up horizontal space as well, lateral space. Then you have the stem of the plant, which can be broken down into different layers. So I wouldn't stress too much about how well you know all of the layers of the plant, um, right? Because we have the epidermis on the external skin of the plant. The cortex is a little more internal. Then you have the phloem and the xylem, right? We talked about those in plant-water relations. Very important for distributing water as well as other nutrients and resources. And then the pith. Um, Out of all five of these, I would say generally understand what the epidermis is, understand what the phloem and xylem are, but you don't really need to know too much about the cortex and the pith. I highly doubt you'll really see questions about either of these on the exam. So, but these three are very important. And that's the outward to inward order of layers in the stem of the plant. Then we look at another sort of growth pattern that we can observe in plants, but unlike primary growth, secondary growth does not happen in all plants. And secondary growth is viewable in woody plants. So obviously, if you think of trees and stuff like that, anything that has like a very woody stem or base, trunk, branches, you know what. That will be exhibiting secondary growth. And often we read secondary growth as widening of the stem or widening of the trunk. And we also can see how much a plant grows and how much secondary growth is being used in a woody plant by how many rings there are in a trunk of a tree and stuff like that. And each ring would represent some sort of growth pattern, maybe a season or maybe multiple seasons, depending on where a plant really exists. And another thing is that it's mainly eudicots that also exhibit secondary growth, because eudicots and woody plants are very similar, mostly overlap, and so that's another important thing to remember. And then obviously there's some specific things that come with secondary growth that are that you won't find in a plant with primary growth. So things like the vascular cambium, as well as bark. Um, Bark is, it can vary in different ways, but it is the protection of these woody plants, and it is sort of like the epidermis of a woody plant or a eudicot. It is the external skin that's protection and stuff like that. And obviously the vascular cambium just underneath, which helps with some more facilitation of, transporting nutrients and water and stuff like that, and very useful as well. If you're in a woody plant, woody plants tend to grow larger, and therefore they need a little more help with transporting nutrients and water around, rather than just using the phloem and the xylem, which are good, but probably won't get the full job done for a woody plant, which will be noticeably larger most of the time. So that is plant growth. Then we actually move on to plant development. So plant development, we're kind of looking into reproduction, but just barely, not really the actual process of how pollen gets to the ovule and stuff like that. But in a general sense, looking at how plant cycles are broken down into gametogenesis and embryogenesis for life cycles. So in gametogenesis, it's pretty self-explanatory. Gameto being in reference to gametes or gamete production, where essentially, the sperm is going to fertilize the ovule, and the that will help fertilize the embryo or the egg or the seed that is needed for creating a new plant somewhere else, the progeny, the offspring of a plant. And then the second part is the embryogenesis, where the actual seed or ovule is planted somewhere and is able to grow on its own. And that early stage growth from a seed into an actual plant is what we call germination. So that is really what ties into embryogenesis. And then at this time, this very early stage of growth and establishment, we have some axes that come up that we have to know as well, that dictate how the plant grows. So first of all, we have a radial axis, which is looking at the horizontal growth in the stem of a plant, and just essentially dictating how the plant grows outwards, as well as where axillary buds might be for lateral growth. And then you have the apical basal axis, which is more vertical, runs up and down through the roots and the stem. And you can tie this into sort of the shoot apical meristem and the root apical meristem. Those are very good tie-ins to the apical basal axis, and they even share that apical name. So those axes of growth are very important. And, even though technically, most non-woody plants don't have secondary growth, they will have radial axes because obviously there is some width to their stems. It's just not going to be the same sort of year-long or seasonal growth that is secondary growth, and so it's navigated differently. Then you really just need to look at the main tissues of the plant in development. These are the main focuses of early development. You have your epidermal tissue, very important, protection for the plant. Make sure it's not fragile, and the insides where all of the nutrients and water is exchanged is, protected. So the epidermal tissue, very important. Then you have ground tissue, used to establish the roots of the plant in the soil, make sure it has a solid structural foundation that it can use to then grow out of, which then ties into vascular tissue, which is obviously what is actually used to transport water and nutrients. And you can really tie vascular tissue to the phloem and xylem, and maybe even more so the xylem because it's very important for transporting nutrients and water around in the plant. And yeah, Sam and Ram are sort of in here with the embryogenesis because Sam and Ram are established in that early germination for as part of the apical basal axis and doing vertical movement up and down through the plant. So yeah, all right, awesome. That was the first outline for plant growth and development. And I'm gonna start a new poll now with some a single question about plant growth and development, and hopefully you guys should be able to answer this one. So let me put up the next question, and I'll give you guys a couple minutes to answer this one, just like I did the last question. So I just launched the poll. I'll give you guys a minute or two to answer this, and once I think that most of the responses are done, we will end the poll, look over the answer, and kind of discuss why we came to the answer from this question. Oh, and sorry, I should have mentioned this before. I have the question on this slide, and it has a little more detail than the actual Zoom poll question because I couldn't fit the entire Zoom poll question I couldn't fit the entire poll question into the Zoom polling apparatus. So yeah. So this might have some more important details that might help you come to a different answer or maybe the same answer, depending on how you read the question here. All right, I will close the poll now. And let me share the results with all of you. So let me just read the question real quick from the slide, and then I will read out what answer was the most selected. So a plant has established itself in new soil with strong roots and a tall enough stem to reach sunlight. Without much competition around, it is now looking to branch out and claim space for its leaves and its flowers. What kind of cell progress will the plant now make to specialize new parts and components for specific purposes? So it looks like from this poll, the most common answer was determinate growth, and primary growth, secondary growth, and indeterminate growth all had about the same amount of responses, but determinate growth was the most definitive answer and most commonly picked answer by a decent amount. So can someone who picked determinate growth please explain to me real quick why they might have chosen determinate growth as the answer for this question? It says that it is already established and is looking to develop new cells for a specific purpose. All right, so that seems like a really important thing to take away from the question. And can you elaborate as to why that's important? And it said claim space for leaves and flowers, right? So what specifically about that description relates to determinate growth? Right, determinate growth happens later when the plant is established and leads to specific cell development. So that's very well put, and I want to highlight this part, specific cell development, right? I mentioned that we're looking at the cell's progress here, what growth will happen in the cells of the plant to help with specialization of parts and components for the plant. And that is very specific to determinate growth. Obviously, looking at cell progress, we're eliminating primary growth and secondary growth because those are talking more about, you know, plants in general, the plant growth in general. But here we're looking specifically at cell growth. And then we're looking at specialized growth, which is determinate growth over indeterminate growth. So yeah, in this case, determinate growth would be the answer. Very well done, everybody. And I hope for those of you who didn't get determinate growth in the poll, can you please give me a thumbs up if you understand why it is determinate growth and not any of the other answer choices necessarily? Right, I see a couple thumbs up. Good, good. So looks like people generally understand. So I'm glad to hear that. All right. So I'm going to stop sharing the results, and then we're going to move on to the next outline now. But well done with that one. Well done with that one, everyone. That is good. All right. So the next outline I wanted to cover is plant hormones and responses. So obviously one of the more contentious ones that we looked at in the big question poll, that people seem to struggle with a lot because it might be harder to differentiate between all the different plant hormones. I can totally understand that. So the way I look at it is first I break it down into plant response, just general stuff about plant response, and then we get into the more minute details of plant hormones. So obviously plant response has to deal with gene expression, growth regulation, and signal transduction. Gene expression mainly being how specific, encoded parts of the DNA in a plant are expressed as phenotypes for the plant and how that translates to the plant's behavior or to the plant's appearance and stuff like that. Growth regulation, that's what a lot of these plant hormones are actually responsible for or help with. How fast the plant might develop, how slow it might develop, how it develops, like what characteristics the plant exhibits. Does it develop, very colorful fruit or ripe fruit or big fruit or stuff like that? Does it tend to shrink or delay its germination or development for later seasons, stuff like that? So growth regulation is really heavily tied to plant hormones. And then signal transduction is essentially, uh, internal communication within the cell along molecular pathways where signals are sent around that help, trigger the release of certain hormones. Like maybe it's very cold outside and the weather conditions are not very good, and the soil is also not very rich in the winter or something like that. Then, a plant might have use signal transduction and specific receptor indicators to nod that the seed should use abscisic acid and delay development or stuff like that. And so, and continue dormancy. And that's an example of signal transduction. So that's also a very important part of how plant hormones are actually put into action by the plant. But obviously with signal transduction, you're communicating within the plant. So you got to have stimuli, your receptor, and a specific type of tropism often. So stimuli are what the plant will be reacting to, whether that's weather conditions or, predation, um, natural phenomena like gravity or, exposure to sunlight, stuff like that. Then you have your receptor. You need some part of the plant that can detect the stimuli. And, the common example that we looked at in class was the tips of plants, the tips of the stems of plants that detected where sunlight was coming from and then bent the plant towards the sunlight so that the leaves or the plant itself could be more exposed to light rays and use them to photosynthesize better. And then phototropism is that kind of tropism where the plants are directing themselves and behaving in a way such that they can benefit from more exposure to light. Um, Gravitropism is also really important too, and also the other major tropism that we really know of that acts on plants, where essentially plants understand which way is up and which way is down in the soil so that they can grow up towards the sunlight with the stem and use the roots and grow those down rather than maybe doing that reverse, because obviously that would definitely not work for the plant, and the plant would be pretty, it wouldn't be well off if it had its roots sticking up and its stem going down. So obviously knowing that the way to go is up with the stem and the way to go is down with the roots, and being able to navigate the outside as well as the soil using gravity as an indicator. So real quick before I jump into plant hormones, I think the best way you could maybe learn about plant hormones here is using a table like this. It's a really great visual, and perhaps it might be hard to see when I'm sharing my screen. It's a little hard to see on my screen, to be honest, some of the writing. But I guess on your own time, maybe zoom into this image and take a better look. There's different categories or functions that happen here in plants, and this gives a key as to which hormones help with what, functions or actions within the plant. And so if you really need a quick way to remember what each one does or how it acts, then this is a great thing to look at for studying, or even maybe something you could definitely put on your review sheet, your cheat sheet, or your study guide during the exam, so that you don't actually have to memorize what each plant hormone does. Just a great reference that you can use if you have confusions about the different plant hormones. So definitely something to look into. All right. With that being said, why don't we jump into the plant hormones? So first, we're going to start with auxin. Auxin, obviously the first one that we are introduced to, very useful for growth in the plant, especially early growth, because rather than, helping the plant branch out or get any lateral space or anything like that, it really helps the plant prioritize growing up vertically and getting towards high sunlight exposure. And it does this by contributing to cell elongation. So specifically in the stem, elongating the cells so that the plant can reach higher up, as well as some differentiation between cells, between a little like some of the purposes and functions, and helping direct cells in that manner. And then obviously, like I was saying, it triggers senescence or lateral bud delay. So the axillary buds don't grow out while the vertical stem is going up. And this is really important because let's say they grew at the same time. Well, not only would you have to be directing resources for both the branches and for the vertical stem, even in early stages, but also what if one of your lower branches gets stuck or caught in something, and then your vertical stem has trouble growing up even further. So that's why it's really important that lateral bud development is delayed early on, and auxin triggers vertical growth primarily through the stem. Then we look at cytokinin. Cytokinin, very important for triggering cell division. If you can remember cytokin, you can tie it to cytokinesis, which is also a step of cell division in cells in general. And so if a plant needs a lot more cells, either to like maybe cover up a wound or some damage, or maybe just to grow really fast, cytokinin is really good because cell division can increase the amount of cells you have, increase mass, and generally propel the plant in a certain direction, or to grow in a certain way. And then you have cytokinin is helping with lateral bud and xylem stomata assistance. So later on, once the plant has grown really tall with the help of auxin, it might bring in cytokinin to develop its branches by applying to the lateral buds and having branches grow out along with the leaves and fruit that might be attached to them, depending on what plant you're talking about. Also helping with the appropriate transfer of nutrients, water, and stuff through the xylem, as well as water from the stomata and maybe some other gaseous, materials and stuff like that. And so cytokinin does really help direct those things. Cytokinin is mainly a growth hormone, so it is very important for senescence delay. It can often delay senescence in leaves and stuff like that. And it's also a really great reactive hormone because if a plant is displaying immediate stress, maybe it's being under attack from predation or something like that, then cytokinin can sort of help the plant react in a way where it can deal with immediate stress, or it can send resources to a site of immediate stress using cytokinin because it triggers that warning. Then you have another very strong growth hormone, gibberellins, that we primarily only look at as a growth hormone. And so just like auxin, is responsible for vertical elongation, so is gibberellin. Gibberellin really also helps with stem elongation. But the main difference that you really want to look at here is that auxin actually stretches the cells themselves and makes them go longer, whereas gibberellin just, signals that the internode elongation or the distance between nodes should be longer. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have stretched out cells, but maybe just longer, just more cells in between each node to have wider internodes. And that can be very useful if you need to distance your branches out from each other so they don't get caught, or maybe you want to have branches at very different levels so you can catch sunlight at different angles and stuff like that. So that's very important. And then finally, gibberellin is also very, very useful for early seed development and germination, as well as late plant development in flowering or fruit development and stuff like that. It can, help make fruits or flowers a lot bigger, or it can help make a plant develop or grow bigger. So gibberellin is a really great growth hormone. And then we have abscisic acid, which is kind of the first one we're looking at that is really mostly a hormone that delays and slows down any plant growth. So it does a lot to delay um, the movement of the roots and the stomata, and sometimes that can be really good, especially in transpiration. It stops a lot of water lossage and stuff like that. So that can be useful, and it's not just something that happens. Abscisic acid is not just a hormone that comes into play when a plant is dying. It can have its own purposes throughout a plant's life. It can also be very useful in triggering senescence. Maybe a part or a specific part of the plant is triggered senescence or full plant. And more importantly, dormancy promotion. And that's kind of the example that we were talking about earlier with signal transduction, where if a seedling is in an environment and in a climate which is not good for foreseeable growth, then abscisic acid that's triggered in the seedling or the embryo can delay growth and just keep the seed as it is until it's actually suitable weather, suitable climate conditions for a plant to grow out of there. And that's really useful as well because that can definitely ensure plant survival and success. And then finally, we have ethylene, which out of all of the plant hormones is really the only gaseous one. It is responsible for a lot of things, including stem elongation as well as auxin transport delay. So maybe you have auxin flowing throughout your plant, but you really don't want to have so much because maybe it's really holding back your axillary buds and stuff like that. Or maybe it's really tapering off the top of your plant. So ethylene can really combat those actions that are being created by auxin. And it's another hormone that helps with stem elongation. So yeah, all of the ones that you see here that help with stem elongation are candidates for growth, vertical growth in that sense. Ethylene is also really good for triggering fruit ripening and making fruits get to what we consider to be a ripe age faster, or the optimal age and optimal state, where it's like the juiciest or the most beneficial and stuff like that. And I don't want you to get confused with gibberellin on that. So gibberellin can induce fruit growth and flower growth, but it's less about getting it to like a ripening situation and more getting it bigger, or developing it into a larger sort of component on the plant. Whereas ethylene is really about aging the fruit to a better time period or something like that, where the fruit might be more useful in a ripened stage if it's taking too long. And then ethylene is also another stress warner, like cytokinin, except ethylene is more of like an environmental stress warning, where, cytokinin was like, oh, there's a predator that's feeding on my plant. My plant's going to react by closing up the wound real quick, or releasing some sort of defense mechanism to immediately get rid of to try and immediately get rid of the danger of the predation. Whereas environmental stress might be some slow change in the environment or climate conditions that the plant detects over time. And ethylene can help the plant eventually deal with that environmental stress over time and slowly adapt or change to fit with the new environment that it needs to be in, such that it is no longer faced with any predicament of the environment and stuff like that. And then as a last note, so proteinase inhibitors and green leaf volatiles, not really like plant hormones like the ones that we talked about, but they are different substances in plants that are very useful for triggering defense mechanisms in the plants that help against predation specifically. So protease inhibitors are very useful in um, preventing animals from being able to fully digest plants. They block off the proteins that help break down plant matter, and so this is useful because if an animal realizes that it can't really eat a plant because it's no longer able to digest the plant because of proteinase inhibitors, then it'll stop eating the plant. You also have green leaf volatiles, which can make parts of the plant maybe um, less appealing, or maybe harmful for animals. And so this is another defense mechanism and another substance that can come into play here. All right. Okay. That was the concept outline for plant hormones and responses. So just like we did with the other question, I'm going to switch over to the slide. Here's the poll question. And let me launch the poll real quick. All right. Okay, I've launched the poll. So I'm going to give you guys a couple of minutes again to answer this new question. And yeah, then we'll cover it after you guys have pretty much all finished. So take a shot at that one. Yeah. All right. Looks like almost all of you answered the poll. So I'm going to close it now. And let's go over what everyone got. So here are the results. It looks like most people said that applying ethylene to the strawberries would have been what Bingo would have done to solve this problem. And I definitely agree with that sentiment. So I'm glad to see so many of you got that answer. And again, just looking back here at this slide for reference, so I see the second most picked option was apply gibberellin to strawberries. And just like I said here in this outline, ethylene is really good for fruit ripening. And as the question said, Bingo's fruits weren't ripening fast enough, and he needed to get them ripe before the winter selling deadline. So applying ethylene, which would ripen your fruit, over gibberellin, which would only help enlarge the size of your fruit or help you know early development or create your make your fruit bigger. This is why ethylene would be preferred in this specific situation. And I hope that makes sense to everybody. So I will close this poll. And yeah, so we don't really have time to do this final one, which I thought, let's see, I think of it as ethylene is for the stage or aging the fruit, and gibberellins is for the size. Yeah, that's a great way of thinking of it like that. So if you guys use that, then uh, yeah, gibberellin might help with more flower development too, depending on what plant you're looking at. But yeah, for this specific example, we're just purely looking at, are we getting the fruit ripe enough? And so gibberellin might increase quantity of fruit or flower as well as size of fruit and flower, but not really aging it, um, like you guys said in the chat. So yeah. All right. All right. And how would light impact the development? Right. Yeah, I saw some of you picked red light and blue light. So red light is and blue light, and more specifically red light, are really more important for early seed development or germination, because it triggers the plants idea to grow, or the ability to grow. As far as aging a fruit, it wouldn't really age a fruit. It might give a plant the sign that maybe it could grow fruits, but not ripening the fruit. Light would not have an impact on that part of development. Light impacts more of the early stage development and general development of plant, not so much the extremities of the plant. So yeah. Cool. All right. Real quick, before we get into the final activity, I want you guys to look at this blank slide, because what I really wanted you guys to do, probably on your own time now, is try and make similar skeletal structures like my outlines here for the plant water relations topic and the plant reproduction topic. I think that'll really help you guys break down the material, and it'll definitely help you guys look at the material in a more digestible way. After this session, I will be making these slides viewable again rather than editable. And so you guys will all be able to make copies of these slides. And if you want, make skeletons on your own copies of the slides, or just write it down somewhere, and that'll be a perfectly fine alternative too. Oh yes, I can resend the link to the slides. Sure. Here they are. Yes. So last thing I wanted to do before we kind of finish out is a Jamboard with the most important concept. So if you guys would please follow the link here, and actually let me just copy this link and put it in the chat so you can access it through there as well. So I've got a Jamboard here, and what I want you guys to do is I want you guys to add the most important concept that you think are needed for this unit as you're studying onto this bubble right here. It could be a phrase, it could be a sentence, it could be just one word or something like that. Whatever concept you feel is really important to study before the Unit 2 exam. This doesn't necessarily have to be something that you struggle the most with, but if what you struggle the most with and what you think is the most important concept to study for the Unit 2 exam overlap, then obviously those can go on the bubble. But I'll give you guys about 2 minutes or so to just add anything to the bubble, and you guys can use the text box or use the pen to add here. And yeah, just have at it. And let's see what you guys come up with. All right, so we don't really have time to look at all of the different notes that you guys place in this bubble, but I really like what you guys put in here, as well as the variety of topics here that really need to be looked at. This is probably something you guys can look at over in your own time, just to see what your classmates think are really the most important concepts you need to be looking at for the Unit 2 exam, and maybe it'll give you ideas for what to study and what to prioritize on your study sheets and stuff like that. So definitely a good reference going forward before the exam. Cool. With that being said, we have reached the end of the session. I know we are almost at 4 o'clock, but I'm still willing to stay here about 5 extra minutes. If you guys have any questions for me, because I know this is the last technically review session for everyone before the exam, although Jessica is going to have an SI session on Monday for the Tuesday people, where they can, get some extra review before the exam. So, but with that being said, does anyone have any questions for me before I close out the session and I let you guys go for the weekend?